Okay, here's our first example of a matched pair t-test. I'll read it to you. A random sample of, actually you can read it to yourself, I sound terrible. Go ahead and take a second to read through it. Okay, so what tells you that it's a matched pair t-test? Well, first of all, there's a couple things that you need to be aware of when you are looking at reading through these. First, the words average, that's what conclude the average. That tells you it's a Z or a T automatically. Greater is going to tell you that it's a single-tailed test. And then these, you can typically write them left or right-tailed depending on how you set them up, and I'll show you about that in a minute. So we'll take a look at that. Because the data comes in two samples, you have two samples here, but the samples are dependent. So it's two samples from the same bank. That's what tells you you have a matched pair t-test. So that is a matched pair t-test. You have samples and they match. There's a match of before and after, 3 years ago today, that kind of thing. So let's do the 5 steps of any hypothesis test. So here we go. Step 1. State the hypothesis. We want to know, is the mean from 3 years ago the same as the mean from today? Or the alternative, remember they say greater, is today, has it gone up? Is it greater today? And so it looks like that. Right? Now, look how this is set up. The way that it's set up, it's actually a left-tail test, even though it said greater, because you have these two things going on. Now, what we're actually going to do is rewrite this as, I'll show you the steps of what's happening here. We're going to do this test and compare it against 0. All right. So if you look at this part right here, this is the difference. Your 3 years ago minus today. That's the difference. So when you write the final hypothesis statement, it should be the mean difference is equal to 0. That means no change. The alternative is the mean difference is less than 0. That means that it actually went up today, because when you subtract a smaller number from a bigger number, you should get a negative number. So this is step 1. So this is your final answer for step 1 right here. It's the mean difference. You put a little d next to your mu sub d, the mean of the difference, is equal to 0, means no change. The mean 0 is less than 0 actually means it is greater, that today is greater. It's important that you set these up correctly, or you'll have the wrong-tailed test and you'll end up with the wrong answer. And now next for step 2. Right? So this now becomes just like a single-tailed t-test. And we find our critical value by hitting inverse t. F5 inverse t. Our degrees of freedom, we had 9 banks. If you go back to the first slide, we had 9 banks. So this is going to be n minus 1, number of pairs minus 1. So our degrees of freedom is 8. Alpha was 0.05. This is left-tailed, so area is 0.015. 0.05. And you're going to shade right there. And we end up getting 1.86, and that's negative. It's left-tailed. Right. So that's our critical value. Next, step 3, we need to calculate our test statistic. So the easiest way to do this is you have been given 2 lists of numbers. I believe the easiest way to do this is put list 1, put the first list into list 1, put the second list into list 2, and then into list 3, you're going to go all the way up to the very, very top of list 3. So list 3 is highlighted. And then you're going to type in equals LIST1 minus LIST2. And then the calculator will calculate for you the differences. So in list 3, you'll have a difference column. That difference column should look like this. So take a minute to practice that on your calculator. You enter these into list 1, you enter these into list 2, and then in list 3, at the very top, you highlight the words list 3, and you write, you erase the little squiggly lines there, and you write instead equal sign list 1 minus list 2. Remember that we're doing this left-tailed, so these should mostly be negative, because if they deposited more today than they did 3 years ago, then you're taking a smaller number minus a bigger number. So once you have this into list 3, then you're going to just run a t-test on list 3. So you're going to go F6, t-test. Choose data. Why? Because we have a list of data. We don't have summarized statistics. It's going to ask for a mu. You're going to write that 0. Because that's what we assume in our, we're assuming mu d equals 0. Right? Then it's going to ask for where your list is. And you are going to tell it list 3. It's going to ask for your frequency. Of course, that stays a 1 every time. And then it's going to ask for your alternative hypothesis. And this is important. You're going to write less than. Because we're looking at this the way that we set it up. It's a left-tailed. Now, how do I set it up the opposite way? Had I done list 2 minus list 1, it would have been a right-tailed and would have been greater than. So I could have done it either way. Then my critical value would have been positive 1.86 and not negative. And everything would have just changed to positive. You could set it up either way. You just have to make sure you're consistent in how you set it up. Right? So you do all that. Hit enter, and you're going to get a test statistic. The test statistic you get is negative 1.67. So if you did that right on your calculator, you should get that number as your test statistic. Right. You'll notice now our step 4 is to make a decision. We do not reject, because it is not in the shaded area. See? So do not reject. Right? And then step 5 is state the hypothesis, or state the conclusion. So we didn't reject, so we're keeping the null. Remember that our null was mu d equals 0, meant no change. So my final hypothesis statement is there is not enough evidence. There is not enough evidence to show the deposits have increased over the last 3 years. No change. That's what we decided. Right? So this is your first example. It's the same as a regular t-test. You just do it on the differences, that single column of differences. So you have one extra step in a match pair t-test. You have to calculate the differences. And you have to be pretty careful how you set it up to make sure you're getting the right tail. And I'm going to do one more example, and then there's a worksheet online for you to do on Canvas.